Hello, historians. Today we're going to discuss the long civil rights movement. Now, it's really likely that you've heard of the civil rights movement. If you've taken any class in 20th century America, if you've paid any attention to African American history or even Mexican American history, or if you're just sort of curious about major leaders and events in American recent memory, you've likely learned a little bit about the civil rights movement. Even if you're not interested in those things, even if you've never taken a class on American history, you've probably heard the names of the three biggest civil rights leaders in history as they've been recorded. You've probably heard something about a woman named Rosa Parks. It's almost impossible you have not heard of Martin Luther King Jr. And you've probably heard about Malcolm X. But the thing is that the overview you've been given, the lessons you've learned in a traditional public high school class, for example, about the civil rights movement, the thing is that when you have a short introduction, like maybe during Black History Month, you don't get the whole story of the civil rights movement. You get what's considered a classical narrative, which is a framing device for storytelling. It's a framing device for literature. And it's a way to tell of a story or a struggle in a way that's easy for us to digest as consumers or as learners, right? But we're historians in this class. We're not just looking for that easy classical narrative. We're looking for what happened, who was involved, what were the sources telling us about it, what did it matter? What was the significance? These are the things we're looking at in this class. So because of that, I want to introduce you to a concept called the long civil rights movement. So as we explore civil rights history in our class together, I really am going to continue to anchor back to this claim or argument about the long civil rights movement. We're going to learn about that today in today's lecture. But before we do, I want to honor anything you've already learned in your families, outside of school or inside of school, that have led you to understand this claim or this theory even better than I may be explaining it to you. Some of you may have parents who are activists in our community, right? So you already know about some of this stuff. I'm just giving an overview of the academic presentation that was made a couple decades ago that was claiming that this is a new way to look at the civil rights movement. So in order to get started, you might want to pull out notes, right? Paper, pen. This lecture is recorded, so you can go back and watch it with or without captions. The other thing you might want to access is Jacqueline Dowd Hall's The Long Civil Rights Movement and the Political Uses of the Past. And that was an article she wrote, which essentially reframed the way academics talked about the civil rights movement in publication and scholarship from the moment that she published it in 2005. So the long civil rights movement, in case I didn't say that correctly, and the political uses of the past. You might want to have access to that article as well as your notes. As always, I am Dr. Summer Cherland. I'm your host and your lecturer today. Here is our lecture on the long civil rights movement, understanding the many aspects of civil rights, Black power, and the Black freedom struggle. Okay, you've got your notes out, you've got your pen and paper. We're going to begin with a quote. Hall says, "Yet remembrance is always a form of forgetting, and the dominant narrative of the civil rights movement, distilled from history and memory, twisted by ideology and political contestation, and embedded in heritage tours, museums, public rituals, textbooks, and various artifacts of mass culture, distorts and suppresses as much as it reveals." That's one of her primary quotes from the text that she wrote that I asked you to access. So what I'd like you to do now is pause the recording, read and reread this quote. Deeply reflect on what you think she's saying. And this can be like a half-formed thought. You don't have to turn in anything to me for me to know that you're thinking about it. I just want you to take the time and energy to pause, read the quote, reflect on it, and then write down what it's making you think, okay? So pause the recording, come back, and we'll start again. Yet remembrance is always a form of forgetting, and the dominant narrative of the civil rights movement, distilled from history and memory, twisted by ideology and political contestation, and embedded in heritage tours, museums, public rituals, textbooks, and various artifacts of mass culture, distorts and suppresses as much as it reveals. I've intentionally selected a famous photo of Martin Luther King Jr. along with just the tagline of the phrase that he gave in his speech on the March on Washington, which gets used over and over again so often that we may actually be distorted in our understanding of what he was saying. His presentation and his performance may be suppressed in our memory more than it is exalted because of the way history twists, because of the way narrative, right, that classical narrative shapes the way we understand certain aspects of American history. So whatever you wrote down is valuable, right? Whether you wrote down that you agree, disagree, you have no idea what she's talking about, any of these things are fine because we're going to explore this further. So Hall presents in her article, which, like I said, was groundbreaking in the presentation of how we understand the framing of the civil rights movement through literature and class coursework, right, as a classical narrative. So what does she mean by the classical narrative? Okay, so you might remember taking like in an English class or a creative writing class or any sort of reading literature type class, you probably learned about the narrative arc in American literature. And what that is, as you can see on the diagram below, it starts with exposition, right? The setting, where, when, who, right? You've got like the presentation of where the story takes place. That typically occurs very early in the narrative. You find out, Cinderella lives in her stepmother's mansion, right? You learn that Daniel is moving to Reseda from New Jersey, and he's kind of a scrappy kid who's new to kind of the California lifestyle, right? You learn things about people that are going to be your main characters. And so the time frame is established, right? Cinderella is once upon a time, so it's a long, long time ago. The Karate Kid is like the 1980s, right? You learn where it takes place and you learn the major characters. And then the next step is rising action. So typically authors, and this is in that classical narrative, typically authors are presenting conflict, but not like the climax of the conflict, not the biggest moment of conflict. They're presenting like all of these little things are building up, right? All of these issues are causing problems for our hero, right? So for example, you have in Cinderella, right? She doesn't get along with her stepmother or her stepsisters. She's treated really poorly as a second-class citizen in the family. She's made to do all of the work, all of the, labor essentially in the house, and she's exempted from all of the things she wants to do, right? So when there's a big event that happens, the prince nearby invites all of the women of the community to come to, all the people really, to come to this big ball. She wants to go, but there's all this conflict because she's not allowed to go and she doesn't have a dress and she can't get there, right? That's your like rising conflict. That's your rising action. You have a variety of issues that come together, and then you have the climax. Then you have the apex of the story. So in Cinderella's presentation, it's when she arrives at the ball and the clock strikes midnight after she's danced with the prince. So there's like this, oh no, everything was here and now all of a sudden everything is here, right? So the climax is that culminating moment in the story. Think of your favorite movie, think of your favorite book, and you can think of like the epic battle scene or the chase scene with the cars, or where someone comes to like a real crisis in their life. That's typically the climax, right? And it can be good or bad, but it's essentially like a culminating moment. Then you have kind of falling action, like when things begin to break away from the story starts to come to an end. Now, this particular diagram is showing you as like it's equal on all sides. So exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, and then resolution, they're all equal and symmetrical. A lot of stories actually use a different kind of presentation of content. So like they might have exposition is long, then you have rising action, then you have climax, and then the falling action is fast, right? So your diagram might look a little bit more abrupt if the falling action happens really quickly. So like with Cinderella, you know, the prince like immediately finds her class slipper. He runs around the countryside trying to find where her, you know, where her foot is. Like he's trying to match her slipper to her foot, and he eventually finds her, and it happens very quickly through the course of the story. You can do this with any fairy tale, essentially. See how fast the action rises, see how fast the action falls. Okay, and then you have resolution, and they lived happily ever after, or the hero wins, the hero slays the dragon, the hero goes home, right? Whatever the resolution is kind of the end of the storyline. So in Jacqueline Dowd Hall's presentation of the classical narrative of the civil rights movement, her criticism isn't about the history itself. She's not criticizing the fact that we're learning and talking and discussing civil rights history. She's criticizing the way in which it's presented. Think of it in terms of like what you learned in 6th grade, right? Not necessarily what you're kind of engaging with now as you're understanding, you know, race relations in America from your own perspective as an adult. Think of it from like how it was presented to you as a kid. For me, it was presented as Rosa Parks, right? It started with Rosa Parks getting onto a bus one day. She was really tired. So I know it's like sometime vaguely around, I don't know, the 50s, because I really sort of knew based on the clothes she might have been wearing. And I knew there was this like little old lady named Rosa Parks who was African-American, and she was super tired because she'd had a really long day at work. And so she gets on a bus, and back then, because it was a long time ago, right, the buses were segregated. Black people had to sit in the back, white people had to sit in the front. And she sat down in the front kind of defiantly. A white man forced her to move or started yelling at her, told her she had to move, and she refused to move because she was just tired of it, right? She was just tired. She'd had a long day and she wasn't going to move. And ultimately she gets arrested. That was sort of the exposition that I was told as a little kid. And even in high school and parts of college, you may have heard that story too, right? But there's a problem with the classical narrative, because then once Rosa Parks gets arrested, there's like a jump, right? There's no real rising action. There's no real like connection. All I know next is that Martin Luther King Jr. gives a speech. He says he has a dream. I think in 5th grade, we like memorized part of his speech and presented it at like a school assembly. And then it was like, and then everybody was equal. That's the resolution, right? Well, Hall is pointing out to us in her article this exact story framing device, which is causing us problems in the way we understand the civil rights movement. So she presents the classical narrative as this. In terms of exposition, the setting takes place in the Jim Crow post-World War II South. So that would be like 1950, 1945 to about 1955. That's where she says the classical narrative places the civil rights movement, capital T, capital C, capital R, capital M, right? Exposition, it's about 1950s-ish, Jim Crow, American South, post-World War II. And you remember Jim Crow means segregated. African Americans and whites are not able to use the same public facilities, the same public services. They can't live in the same neighborhoods. They can't go to the same schools. They can't have the same jobs, right? They might have separate jobs, but they have to be equal, right? So that's the exposition. It begins in about 1954 with the passage of Brown v. Board. Now, you might remember Brown v. Board is when a Kansas father sued all the way to the Supreme Court so that his daughter could go to a white school. She was African-American, he was African-American. And the Supreme Court ruled that the 1896 Supreme Court decision of separate but equal was actually unconstitutional, and that segregation in public services was no longer federally allowed. So statewide, federal and nationwide, no segregation could be on the books. So that's kind of 1954, right? That's the exposition, the beginning or the setting. Then Hall points out that our rising action starts with things like the March on Washington, which is 1960s, right? You've got the Selma March, which is sometimes considered Bloody Sunday. You might see the Freedom Rides, which is this the college and high school kids who integrate the bus system all the way into the Deep South. Or you might see the Freedom Summer, which is a voting rights movement in the American South. All of this is taking place in the Deep South, right? And your rising action is activists sort of moving towards a climax or a big moment. Now, what Hall believes happens in the way that we present this narrative, the way we share information in kind of a classical way, is the climax culminates with moral clarity. America comes to its senses, right? So after the rising action of all these public protests, America is awakened to the fact that all men and women are created equal, regardless of race, color, or creed, right? And this is symbolized by federal legislation like the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So the climax for this particular narrative is seen as like a success story, a triumph, right? But then in the classical narrative, Hall points out, your falling action is really sloping. It's not that sharp decline like I pointed out earlier with the annotation. It's a longer, slower process of falling action. And the decline of the civil rights movement in the classical narrative, according to Hall, is you have kind of a new focus in the classroom on the Vietnam War, African Americans participating perhaps in the Vietnam War. You have discussions of urban decline, right? Cities kind of falling into disrepair and the rise of crime throughout the United States. You also have a small discussion of Black Power movements, the Black Panther Party. This is where Malcolm X is typically introduced, though he and Martin Luther King Jr. were contemporaries. They weren't, one didn't come before the other, but the way they're typically presented is as if one was during rising action and one was during falling action. And then typically there's kind of a discussion of like affirmative action legislation and new policies on welfare. And then for Hall, once you have this declining moment, the resolution of the story she sees in the classical way of telling the civil rights movement is that we have something like Black History Month or a Black History Monument or a Black History movie. Maybe in class you watched a movie, right? So the resolution is kind of, and now we have civil rights and we all remember it together, right? It's kind of this bow is tied on it. So that may be kind of familiar to you. You may have learned the story of the civil rights movement through this classical narrative of exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, and resolution. But Hall takes issue with this. And because of her claims, we review in this class and we look at this particular approach in a different way. I want you to pause the recording and really look at this question. Really look at the grayed out words that I provide in this particular slide. What is wrong with this classical narrative? What do you think is wrong? You've now had several weeks of this class, or you've taken several lectures with me where you know about the Black freedom struggle from as early as the 1600s, right? So why does it begin in 1954 when you know that Black activists have been around since the beginning of African imported slavery, right? You might also know that like in the 21st century, there's a significant amount of African American based protests, right? You may also know about integrated approaches to these kinds of things where whites and Blacks and Latinos and Asians are working together to improve the quality of life that people have across the country. So pause the tape, really reflect on that column on the left of what the classical narrative of the civil rights movement has taught you. Really reflect on what you yourself have known about the civil rights movement and how you define the Black freedom struggle. And answer this in your own opinion. What is wrong with this story or this narrative? All right, welcome back. So Hall presents one way of looking at it, and we'll look at it in a second way as well. The first is, I know my little icon is kind of floating around, but the first is she says, we need to look at the civil rights movement as a longer struggle. She called it the long civil rights movement. It doesn't start in 1954 and end with the Voting Rights Act of 1964. It doesn't start with Brown v. Board in 1954 and end with the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., right? That is not the beginning and end of the civil rights movement. Hall instead says, no, this is a longer movement. It starts with enforced human slavery in America. And when does it end? Does the civil rights movement end in the 1990s with urban decline, the rise of welfare, right? Does it end in the 21st century with the Black Lives Matter movement? What is it that ends the civil rights movement, and has it ended? Is it a civil rights movement, or is it a longer, broader struggle for Black freedom? The other thing that gets introduced is the concept of the broader civil rights movement. So the longer civil rights movement and the broader civil rights movement. On the left, we have the classical narrative, the exposition of the civil rights movement in the classical narrative. Everything takes place for the most part in the South. So you can see that map. You've got events happening in Texas, you've got events happening in Louisiana, Mississippi, Arkansas, Kentucky, Tennessee, a lot happening in Alabama, a lot happening in Florida and South Carolina. Maybe Washington, D.C. is about as far north as our coverage goes because of the March on Washington. But if you look at it from the other perspective, from the broader narrative, and this is the way I hope that you look at it in our class, is actually the civil rights movement. Not only did it start before 1954 and continue after 1968, it actually spanned the entire country, right? It includes places like Seattle, which is the exact opposite of the Deep South on the American map. It involves places in Boston, or Massachusetts rather, New York, New Jersey. There was civil rights activity here in Arizona. So not only is the classical narrative limited in its time frame, it's also limited in its setting, in its location. Civil rights activity, activism, protests, riots, or violence, police brutality, voting concerns, all of those things happened across the country. So here's a good example for you. In the classical narrative, it's presented as if segregation was a South problem, that people in the South had rules, they had laws on the books that Black people couldn't, say, use certain swimming pools because those were white swimming pools. Well, I want you to just go ahead and Google East Lake Park. Just look up East Lake Park and learn the history of the Phoenix community known as East Lake Park. Or you might think, well, in the West, it might, like in the East, they had, in the Southeast and Deep South, they had like laws, right? It was actually written in their state constitution that Blacks had to live in a certain place and whites had to live in a certain place. But in the West, it was more kind of what they called de facto. So like people segregated on practice. People segregated because that's where their folks were, right? They lived in Black communities because other Black people lived there. They lived in Asian communities because other Asian people lived there. Same for whites, same for Latinos. You may think that it's a very realistic thing to consider. That's called de facto segregation, segregation by practice. Whereas de jure, D-E space J-U-R-E, de jure segregation is legal. It's actually written in law. So you may assume like, okay, so the West was probably more de facto, the East and South were probably more de jure, except when Phoenix, which is a Western city, no, right? When Phoenix was established in 1887, one of the very first laws put on the books for the township was that African Americans, Native Americans, and Mexican or Mexican Americans could not live north of the railroad, which is just maybe a mile north of the Salt River. They weren't allowed to rent or buy property north of the BNSF railroad line. That was 1887, and it was written in law. So is that de facto or is that de jure? Is it classical or is it broad? Here's another aspect of the longer, broader civil rights movement that we are going to engage in this class. If we were looking at the classical narrative, we would look at these four leaders. We would look primarily at Martin Luther King Jr. He is the hero. He is the darling of the classical civil rights movement. And there's reason for that. He is only rivaled by Rosa Parks, right? Rosa Parks is seen as like an American hero, and she is, but she's not the only hero of the civil rights movement, nor is Malcolm X. So Malcolm X is typically discussed in the classical narrative as part of the falling action, the downfall of the civil rights movement. He was too violent. He was too aggressive. He was too intellectual, right? There's this critique of Malcolm X as if he is the reason the civil rights movement came to an end in the classical narrative. We will not look at it that way in this class. We will not pose leaders against each other in this class. And then on the far left at the top, you see W.E.B. Du Bois. He is also seen sometimes in the classical narrative as providing kind of like, almost like a fairy godmother type, sage, spiritual guide approach to the heroes of the civil rights movement. So if we were focusing on the classical narrative, those four folks would be the people we would struggle or we would focus on the most. But instead, look on the right, look at the longer, broader movement. 40,000 African-American bus riders protested the Montgomery bus system in 1955. The reason Rosa Parks is famous is not because she was a little old Black lady, which by the way, she was not old. And she was not this little old timid Black lady. She was an activist for the NAACP. She was a plant on that bus. She picked that bus, and that bus driver, with the support of the local NAACP, they targeted that bus. And in fact, the person who yelled at her to move seats was not a white patron. It was the bus driver. And she did not move off of that seat because she wanted to be arrested. Because the plan was, as soon as Rosa Parks was arrested, 40,000 other people were poised to protest and boycott the Montgomery bus system in 1955. If nobody's taking the bus isn't making any money, and the bus can no longer run, okay? So on the classical narrative, there's this old little lady who starts the civil rights movement, but we don't really know how. On the longer, broader side, we know that it was part of a large struggle, a large network, a circuit of people who were ready to make change. How about this? 13 original freedom riders, Black and white bus riders, who made this plan to essentially integrate the Deep South by sitting on buses together in Black and white pairs and riding from Washington, D.C. all the way into, I believe they go into Louisiana. Their plan was to go into Louisiana. 13 original freedom riders on cross-continental bus, essentially from one area into the South. They didn't succeed. They succeeded, but they didn't finish the job, and you should look up why. 10 college students, one of them a high school student, I believe, actually finished the job for them. Do you know any of those people? Do you know any of their names? Some of you might, a lot of you may not. That's because you have been told the classical narrative of the civil rights movement from like childhood, but there's more to the story, and that's what we engage in this class. How about this? You know that "I Have a Dream" speech that Martin Luther King Jr. gave that's so famous? People quote Martin Luther King Jr. all the time. As Martin Luther King Jr. once said, right? Okay, that's awesome. But he wasn't speaking to himself. He wasn't giving a speech in front of a mirror. He wasn't speaking to Congress. He wasn't speaking to the Supreme Court. 250,000 people attended the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. Without those 250,000 souls, Martin Luther King Jr. would be giving a speech to no one, right? He'd be giving a speech to an empty reflecting pool. So please remember that even though he was the one whose words get quoted, 250,000 people were listening and cheering and chanting and had marched there and ridden buses there. 600 people were on the bridge from Selma to Montgomery on Bloody Sunday. Do we know any of their names? Do you know any of their names? I know one, right? I know a couple, but I know one that comes to mind right away. And here's one statistic that I think is really fascinating. In the longer, broader story of the civil rights movement, there were 2,000 members of the Black Panther Party local chapters at its height. So when it was at its most prominent, there were 2,000 people who joined the Black Panther Party. So no, the Black Panther Party, the rise of Black power, was not part of the falling of the civil rights movement. It was not the falling action of the civil rights movement. It was part of the longer, broader story. So here are some varied voices, for example. You may not know any of these names, but I hope by the end of our time together in this class, you will know more of them. Booker T. Washington, he's sort of the counterpoint to W.B. Du Bois, Fannie Lou Hamer, Ella Baker, Huey P. Newton, Bobby Seale, Eldridge Cleaver, Angela Davis, all of the Black Panther Party, Diane Nash, who was a freedom rider, Stokely Carmichael, who actually coined the term Black Power, although Malcolm X gets a lot of credit for that. He founded the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and he was a very significant member and founding member of the organization known as CORE. My hope is that by the end of our time together, you will no longer focus on these 4 leaders who get plenty of attention outside of the scholarly place, outside of the scholarly realm. My hope is that as a scholar, as a historian, you will investigate the lives of people like these varied voices and the contributions they made to the longer, broader civil rights movement beyond those big 3 or 4, right? My hope is that by the time you're done with this class, you have a more complex understanding of the civil rights movement in American history. And that's it. I look forward to hearing what you have to say and hearing what you think and seeing what you've learned about the longer, broader civil rights movement.